Feeling good, wanna feel great. Longevity starts, don't hesitate. Too much noise, what do you choose? Trendy hacks, conflicting news. Skip the myths, come hear what's true. From world-class experts straight to you. First and third Thursdays, 7 p.m. Science, health, and our team. Brain to heart, from food to rest. Live the talk on living your best. Thursdays at 7, we'll see you there.
If you want to look at your brain resilience, I would still highly recommend you do a brain scan. Yeah.
Okay, so is that then also in alignment with the entire idea that we are aging at different speeds in our body within one individual? So you can have inflammation in your brain, you can have proteostasis problems in your muscles, or you can have a different hallmark of aging, so different pathological mechanisms in your lung or in your skin.
Nowadays, people are talking about brain heart, brain gut, and brain muscle, right?
Yeah, so everything connected.
Correct. So we need to be able to identify, which part you would like to improve on and then work on it. There will be different pathways, will be different networks in your brain corresponding to the certain dimension of aging.
Welcome to the National University of Singapore Yonglin Lin School of Medicine's Healthy Longevity webinar. Thanks for joining us. What you just saw was a snapshot from our last episode with Associate Professor Helen Zhou on brain resilience. She also talks about brain imaging and AI. So be sure to catch the full episode on YouTube. Tonight we have Associate Professor Michael Dunn, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say. As you listen, we would love for you to ask questions, so use the Q&A function to send those questions, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Tonight, we have Kevin Chua, a PhD candidate from our program, to moderate your questions. So let's learn more about Kevin.
Oh, were you waiting for that box to hit me? Hi, my name is Kevin, and I'm a third-year PhD student from Prof Sajikumar's lab. I usually like to start my day early to keep my mind sharp. But what am I keeping my mind sharp for? Anyways, my work primarily focuses on transcranial direct current stimulation on juvenile stress rat cognitive impairment. Let's get out of here. So transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS, is a non-invasive, cost-effective neuromodulatory technique that has been shown to improve symptoms of depression and schizophrenia. Now, it works by delivering a low amplitude current across brain regions to either excite or inhibit neuronal population. And this has been shown to improve behavior and even memory. Have we been here for too long? Let's get out of here.
Let's talk about how we study synaptic plasticity through the lens of electrophysiology. Synapses are small junctions that allow neurons to communicate, and our neurons are highly adaptable processes that constantly reshape how they respond based on past activities. Let's look at this traffic camera footage capturing the activity happening along a stretch of Customs toll gates. On a normal day, you observe that only a few toll gates are open to manage the flow of traffic. We can think of this as the baseline state of synapses. Since no significant activity has occurred yet, there is no need to activate the other toll gates. However, the Customs Office received news that for today, a public holiday, all tolls are free. And this is massive news. Right? In order to accommodate the massive influx of cars coming, the Customs Office opens up more gates. In the electrophysiological sense, a tetanic stimulation is like the free toll signal. It's new and exciting. We use recording electrodes to measure changes in ion flow, just like how the traffic camera monitors traffic flow in real time. And that would make the ion channels on the synaptic membrane the toll gates. Just as toll gates are flexible in opening more or fewer lanes, our brains are plastic and change throughout our lives. We know aging impairs our brain's plastic nature. And it is as if aging weakens our neurological customs office, making it difficult for them to regulate the flow as efficiently as they used to before. Could TDCS keep our brains flexible even with old age? This is too much science for today. I'm gonna take a break at the pantry.
So, I recently started to chair the Young Scientists Club, and we aim to nurture the next generation of scientists to be leaders in the aging research field. We have so much planned for you guys, including a PQE workshop. You know, as a PhD student myself, I understand how nerve-wracking it can be to prepare for your PQE. And, you know, we hope that this workshop will be able to build confidence and make the experience a more memorable and enjoyable one. Apart from science, I love cooking. And in fact, if you think about it, cooking is kind of a science, right? You work on your recipes, you do it again and again, you improvise, you change things, and then you get to eat it, right? You can't really eat agarose. Anyways, I also been drumming for 17 years, and I feel that music is a great way to build discipline, as well as putting in time to work on something that you really like. And I think that has really influenced the way that I approach science. So that's enough about me. If you'd like to connect, these are my socials, and I will see you around. I'm not coming to level 5 again.
Kevin, if I didn't know better, I think you're trying to take out frustration with those drums, not, be creative. It looks you're hitting them very hard. I don't want to be the drums. Let's put it that way. So our guest today is Associate Professor Michael Dunn, Director of Education at the Center for Biomedical Ethics at NUSMedicine. His research explores ethical issues in healthcare practice and policy with a particular focus on aging, long-term care, mental health, and cognitive impairment. Internationally recognized for his work in bioethics, he's made significant contributions to both research and education in the field. The topic tonight is an ethics manifesto for healthy longevity research and practice. Welcome, Michael. Thanks for joining the show.
Thanks very much, Brian. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for giving up an hour of your Thursday evening to listen to a talk on ethics, which I imagine is not a common occurrence for many of you on the call. So it's great to be here. It's great to be invited, and I'm looking forward to really having the chance to explore and explain some of the ethical dimensions of healthy longevity with the audience today, and making the case for the need for ethics as part of the evolution of healthy longevity in research, in clinical practice, in the design of health systems and such like. And it's great that the healthy longevity team are so open to these different disciplinary perspectives. It's great to contribute to the conversation. So let me share my slides and I'll make a start. So, rather grandly, I've called this talk an ethics manifesto. That's really just to try to make as strong a case I can for why I think the ethical aspects of healthy longevity are worth spending time on, worth thinking through, and are fundamental to the success of the various initiatives that are involved. Now, I'm not a scientist by background. I work in healthcare ethics, and I've been doing that for about 25 years. And I'd like to bring some of those insights from ethical thinking and research in ethics in a healthcare setting to the table in relationship to healthy longevity today. So let me move on. So my starting assumptions are very thin, but I hope that you'll be on board with this without much need for argument. What interests me about healthy longevity, and why I've started to think a bit more about it since moving to Singapore 4 years ago, is I think as a domain of healthcare practice, it has some quite potentially radical implications for how we think about designing a health system, for how we think about engaging with patients, and how we think about developing public health interventions, and even in how we think about public policy and our social responsibilities more generally, as we kind of disrupt conventional ways of thinking about aging and the life course. New questions come to mind that stretch way beyond healthcare into questions of pensions, retirement, and this kind of thing. So I think, ethically speaking, it connects to big questions about what we value, how we value it, and how, as a society, we want to develop our ways of living together in the right kinds of ways. I think for good practice to be enacted and shaped, an ethics conversation is needed to be part of the science, part of the development of public policy in healthcare, and also in the development of clinical practice. And I hope that many of you will agree with that, at least by the end of this talk, if not now. Okay, so one of the reasons why I think we need ethics here is that at the core is a range of different kinds of ethical challenges and questions. One of the things I want to tell you a bit more about in a minute is the relationship between population level change in healthy longevity and the individualization or the precision-based approach that we see in precision biomedical interventions, for example. There is, I think, at the core, a tension between those two goals, between realizing population level improvements to the health span of a country or a society overall, and trying to tailor those interventions to meet the particular health-related goals around well-being, the good life, preventing illness, engaging with the world in the right kind of way that the person values, as an individual set of goals. And that tension between the population and what it means to tailor interventions in the right kind of way comes up in different places. It comes up when we think about health system development, but also in the design and implementation of specific interventions that we might roll out in the clinics, for example. And in the background around this, partly because this is a novel area with significant, very rapid developments, there's a significant amount of uncertainty around evidence, around clinical appropriateness of intervention, around the risk associated with those, and about uncertain benefits as well, which is the kind of thing that ethicists like us think about when we come to think about translating interventions into practice in the right kind of way. So my claim, I guess, is that ethics has a positive role to play, and I'll say a bit more about this towards the end as well. I think, like we are in healthcare generally, we can be an ally and critical friend in trying to translate the potential and the goals of healthy longevity into appropriate ways of conducting ourselves, either as researchers, as health system planners or policymakers, or as healthcare practitioners. And what I see as very interesting in this area, and why, again, perhaps ethics is particularly relevant and necessary, is this frontier spirit, a fast-moving, fast-paced set of developments that need to be carefully marshaled and orientated so that they realize the right kinds of values in the right kinds of ways. And I think that's what the ethics role can help with in different kind of focused areas. I want to describe now what I'm calling an ethics pipeline for healthy longevity. And I want to thank my colleague, Henry Dobson, who's done a lot of work on this area as well, thinking about this pipeline and has his own way of formulating it. And I draw heavily on that. The pipeline consists of different levels of questions that I think the ethicists can support and engage in. So the very highest level is a kind of set of conceptual questions that are in the background of all that we do, and that raise issues around the boundaries of the work, what's in and what's out of healthy longevity, how do we locate it, how do we specify it. This is an interesting one because I remember last year debating Hans Medj from the Healthy Longevity Academy about the nature of healthy longevity medicine. And his argument at that time was all of health and all of healthcare is healthy longevity. And that struck me as both kind of convincing but quite problematic when we're trying to strive to develop a particular niche or a set of kind of particular focused interventions or a domain, a specialty of clinical practice. So one question is, where do we draw the boundaries between what's healthy longevity and what's health or healthcare, but not healthy longevity? I don't think that's as straightforward as it might first appear. At the meso or the middle level, I think the ethicist has a role to play in answering and engaging in questions around how we properly design a health system to prioritize health longevity in the right kind of way. This is questions about design, location, finance, and questions of justice and equity that come up in those debates. And finally, at the micro level, this is my particular interest as an academic, in the clinical context, how we think about the appropriate practice when we are encountering patients, when we're engaging with communities. How do we navigate the values of the patient, the obligations to do good to those patients in a way that meets their need in the relationship of a healthcare practitioner-patient kind? And my observation here is that the toolbox that ethicists have can be brought to bear in different kinds of ways in these different domains of concern. So at the level of how should we conceptualize health longevity, one of the skills, I think, of the ethicist here is to bring high-level conceptual analysis, philosophical reasoning, understanding the nature of the concept, and trying to understand what the criteria are for certain things to be fulfilled, for health longevity to be described in the right kind of way. That's a kind of philosophical project that we're heavily engaged in across healthcare. At the meso and micro level, it's a practical ethical reasoning. And the difference here, I think, is that organizational ethics, the ethics of health systems, considerations around justice, equity, and the appropriate governance of services, they fit in the meso level. And there are some specific questions that medical ethicists are very concerned about in relationship to good practice, ethical practice at the clinic, in the clinic, at the bedside, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the kind of toolbox, I think, that maps onto those different domains. So let me go through each one in a bit more detail and flesh them out, and then describe a little bit about how I want to put this manifesto into action to describe some of the work that we're doing in the Centre for Biomedical Ethics, where I'm based, to try to move some of this work forward. So, as I said, the highest level is a set of conceptual questions, and I'll just describe a couple of areas of concern and interest. I should say, perhaps here, that the manifesto that I'm laying out doesn't have an awful lot of answers right now. It raises a series of questions. So this is an agenda-setting presentation in that sense. I'm not going to give you the answers to questions you might want firm answers to, but I hope to steward the conversation towards the kind of answers that we all might want to give to these thorny, difficult, emergent questions that I've laid out. So one of the core questions, as I mentioned, is how we should conceptualize healthy longevity itself. One thing that strikes me immediately about this is that as a field, and I'm taking this to be the kind of healthcare end rather than the research end at the moment, health longevity looks to have a clinical face and a public health face to it. And precision geromedicine captures the clinical face. So that's, as you all know, the use of biomarkers, risk stratification, tailored interventions, to support an individual's health span, and to improve health span for the individual. But the public health face is perhaps more like precision public health. It's using the same kinds of data, but different interventions to improve healthy life expectancy across a population, to reduce age-related disease burden, and to reshape environments and systems across the life course for health-related outcomes, positive health-related outcomes. Now, the Health Longevity Medicine Society conceptualizes this as a sort of personalized preventive medicine. And I think that's right, but I think it's important to recognize that the personalization is at both, or the precision nature of the interventions, is at both the level of the person, the individual patient, shall we call them, or the individual service user if they're not in a patient environment, and the group or community level, which could realize public health goals for larger groupings of people across Singapore, in particular neighborhoods, etc. These questions capture the basic purpose of healthy longevity medicine. There's a second set of interesting conceptual questions worth engaging with that I think are about what we ought to prioritize in how we conceptualize healthy longevity medicine. Now, these debates are not particularly new, but they are reinforced, I think, when we think about public policy priorities, and particularly health policy priorities, and also research priorities around this. How do we make trade-offs between the value of extending lifespan and the value of increasing health span? How do we weigh up quantity and quality of life when it comes to investments of time, energy, resources, etc., in those debates. Now, it seems to me that in Singapore, the priority has very much orientated towards health span, and in my view, good reasons. But there is a question about the weighing up of those different kinds of manifestations of the value of the outcomes. There's also complexities about how we can figure a notion of health at the core of healthy longevity. Often this is described in the scientific context in relationship to intrinsic capacities and resilience. But in the WHO field of international policy around promoting healthy aging, the emphasis is more about capability, real-world opportunities to flourish in certain kinds of ways in your life. A very kind of less technical and more sort of embodied social relational notion of the good life. And my colleagues in CBME, Brian Earp and Julian Savulescu, both of whom have interest in this area as well, are raising this idea of the concept of the well span as an alternative to health span, that really the value of our interventions in this domain does not rely in health outcomes, it relies in broader well-being outcomes and how we support those, where health is one but not the only component of well-being. So that's something I think, again, that we're interested in thinking about. Okay, let me move on. So the second domain, the mesoscale domain, we have big questions around the design of services, the design of the systems within which healthy longevity gets activated and how it's positioned in the right kind of way. Now, I want to take a few points here separately. Firstly, if we understand healthy longevity and we think about the public face of it, the public health face of it rather, we might configure healthy longevity as a public health paradigm of a novel kind, where the emphasis perhaps is on a community-based approach to apply mechanisms of community modification with the goal of improving health span. And we see in various initiatives across Singapore, and most notably perhaps the Queenstown Health District project, this kind of aim of almost recalibrating, redesigning the very fabric of our everyday lives within our housing, our community environments. How do we shape neighborhoods and the built environment in which we live to realize and promote the health goals we're trying to achieve here? And how far can we go, or should we go, to modify what public health ethics people call choice architecture, the range of choices from which we could choose, which are manipulable by where we place, how we regulate, for example, the location of a fast food restaurant versus a running track. We can manipulate that architecture, not deny person the access to that particular tool or intervention, but we can change the ease by which they can access it. When is that appropriate, and on what basis should we make those kinds of changes? This raises questions about equity and justice. So, to what extent is it reasonable to impose certain kinds of burdens on communities? How do we think about intergroup differences in outcomes and possibility, capability around those kinds of considerations? What degree of control through, for example, participatory governance should communities exercise over changes of these kinds? Because these are not like normal public health interventions where the impact on each individual is relatively minor. I'm thinking things like the Nutrigrade rating on food items. Here we are changing people's life circumstances and the kind of possible range of options that they take part in their own communities. That's an area of interest, I think, for people working on health longevity ethics at this domain. As a new medical specialty, we're thinking about here precision geromedicine. When we think about the mesoscale, there are big and important questions that I know many people in Singapore are currently very interested in around the location, the funding, and the design of the big picture service options available to people. One of that is the appropriate balance between private and public health provision in healthy longevity. I think Singapore stands out as having one of the very few places in the world where there is at least some public health service in healthy longevity. And perhaps most importantly of all, and this is something I think I'm interested in thinking more about at the moment, the balance between secondary and primary care provision and how we ought to instigate healthy longevity medicine into the primary care sector in particular, because it seems to me that's the obvious place where meaningful change of the kind that we're trying to bring about will be located. So here we have difficult questions of, again, familiar kinds to people working in healthcare ethics. What degree of priority should we give in a health system to healthy longevity medicine? Now, if we take a conceptual view where all of health is healthy longevity, that question doesn't really arise. But if we're thinking about investing in a particular specialty or a particular set of interventions that are different from cancer care, let's say, what degree of money is spent and what pot is it taken from to fund and support those kinds of interventions? What degree of subsidy should people be provided with in relationship to broader health promoting interventions that may be more well-being impactful rather than purely healthcare impactful? And what regulatory models should be put in place to govern all of this? And particularly the rapid expansion of the interventional armory in relationship to gerotherapeutics and such like that people are now being used, people are using. They don't naturally fit into existing categories around medical devices or pharmaceutical products. How do we provide a kind of responsive regulatory model? And again, I think the ethicist and the lawyer can come in with some guidance on those points. As I said, one of my interests in this area is goes beyond healthcare to think about the impact of this set of questions for broader public policy priorities. If we reconfigure age biologically rather than merely chronologically, for example, there are question marks over how we then reconfigure other aspects of our social lives and our policy tools that shape the life course in different kinds of ways. Eligibility for screening, access to health insurance and age-related cutoffs, compulsory retirement ages, eligibility for pensions. Here, I think the ethical questions are partly core questions about what justice and age discrimination might invoke as questions, how we calibrate changes to those kinds of age thresholds. We have to think about what the life course consists in, how we fairly distribute that, what it would mean to avoid discrimination in changing thresholds in certain kinds of ways. But we also have more specific kind of technical questions around the ethics of managing the data that's produced through these kinds of initiatives. How do we ensure that the right kinds of institutions and companies get hold of the right kinds of data in the most appropriate way? Is there a risk of health span profiling, and what might that mean for equity and justice across the society? Okay, and finally, onto the micro scale, which is, I think, probably my biggest area of interest, given my own interest in medical ethics. Here, I think, again, Henry Dobson has done some important thinking about this with me. There's a set of questions about what the basic principles of medical ethics mean and how they ought to be realized and applied and considered carefully in the context of healthy longevity. So here's a couple of examples of ethical principle type questions that I think we need to be careful to work through in thinking about the precision geromedical end of clinical healthy longevity. So what does it mean to respect a person who is coming into the healthy longevity clinic? How should we assess and evaluate and manage the benefits and risks of interventions, particularly given the uncertainties and in some cases the lack of evidence or clear evidence for certain kinds of interventions? So one thing that I'm thinking a bit about here, and this partly comes from a piece of research I was doing with members from the Health Longevity Academy in the Prometheus study, where we did some qualitative interviews with some of the research participants in Prometheus. And we were talking to them about what it would mean to be appropriately situated in a healthy longevity care environment. What do they value in receiving interventions of these kinds? How do they understand their purpose and what the patient or the user might need? And one of the things that comes up here is a slight modification, I think, to the basic principle that many of you will know of respecting autonomy. This idea that what we should do in any healthcare setting is respect the patient's preferences. We should adhere to their self-determined life plans and shape our interventions around what they want, what they choose autonomously. I think what we see in healthy longevity is a push that respecting that person's choices is perhaps not just limited to questions around, are we respecting the person's choice? Are we ensuring their consent? It's partly also about promoting their autonomy. It's about promoting their abilities to navigate and self-care. It's about enablement and empowerment as much as it is about respect for choice or decision-making. And one of the participants in this research study that we did said, look, there's just so much tracking and data. You know where your weaknesses are, and I can try to do something about it now. So this idea of seizing some control over the health journey from the practitioner, from the researcher, into the patient, into patient control of their own navigated journey through healthcare, suggests a different kind of way about what it might mean to respect a patient who wants to take some control over that journey for themselves. So there's an interesting question about how we respect patients and perhaps think about these ideas of enablement and empowerment in ways that we might not think quite so clearly in some other domains of medical practice. I think also we might reconfigure the relationship, the core relationship between, let's say, doctor and patient or nurse and patient, from one where it's more hierarchical to one where it's more collaborative in nature. So it seems that what people are describing much of the time and what many of the ways of thinking about the aims and the practice of health longevity over the life course is one where the patient is managing their own journeys towards longer health span, but it's one where they're carefully stewarded and led on that journey carefully through various specified personalized health and well-being goals. This, I think, emphasizes the need for very much a team-based, integrated system approach. You can't sort of do this in a narrow silo. It's not an individual doctor or nurse relationship that can realize that journey, I think, in the right kind of way. So the collaboratory here is a kind of team-based one. But it also suggests that a different kind of approach towards preventative healthcare in the clinic is one that needs to be much more focused on personalization in planning, reviewing, and targeting interventions and outcomes that are tailored to the person in the right kind of way. And the continuity of care over the long term is going to be just as important as the one-off interactions that healthcare practitioners will have with patients in the development and design of this approach. And secondly, looking about benefits and risks, we also see, I think, in that journey towards stewarded, personalized care, that people will embrace broader holistic notions of well-being. So this participant we spoke to in Prometheus talked about, the need to speak to all aspects, emotionally, mentally, physically. It's not about being self-sufficient or self-reliant, not doing things on your own, being able to relate, to communicate, to still have friends, to still live life. But still living life and thinking about preventative interventions to enable a person to live life for as long as possible. It's rather different from a narrower configuration on health span or health outcomes. There's some work to be done here, I think, to navigate between these conceptual questions that are coming up from the patient perspective, at least. How do we align those kinds of things in the right kind of way? Interestingly, in Singapore, one of my other areas of research interest is in the ethics of integrating biomedical practice with traditional medicines. And there are some interesting insights that are coming up from conversations in Singapore with various members of the public about health longevity and how it fits in local practice traditions of faith, but also culturally configured notions of healing and aging. So there is particular complexity here around different ethnic groups, around how healing and aging is configured, how different groups are more or less receptive to different kind of ways of understanding the aging process across the life course, what it means to age, what it means to be old, and how we think about prevention as part of healing. That also has a faith-based element in some regards. And I think also the idea of health longevity being configured not just as an individualistic journey stewarded by a healthcare practitioner, but as a familial and social project that people participate in together is also something that needs careful configuration here. And I think in a clinical context, that needs to be taken very seriously in how we act in a personalized, but not necessarily individualized way. Okay, let me just go through this to the end because I'm running out of time. I want to say a little bit about where we go next for the ethics angles on this. I think, the manifesto is all well and good. It's great to lay out an agenda. It's great to lay out some priorities. But how do we enact some of these elements in real world research or practical change? So here's a couple of things I want to say about the ethics role here and how it can be supportive. I see ethics as an enabler, not a barrier. So what we're trying to achieve here is the improvements in translation from research into practice. We're trying to improve the quality and the ethical justifiability of the kinds of interventions we want to put in place in the real world. We're not trying to put hurdles in the way of new interventions finding their way to patients. We're trying to make sure we calibrate that journey in an ethically appropriate way. That might mean some tinkering at the edges, but it doesn't mean stopping things from happening. It's important, I think, to be responsive rather than idealistic. So, ethical thinking here needs to respond to what is going on the ground already. What is the Singaporean health policy position on this? What are the research agendas that people like Brian are pursuing? And how do we respond to enable those in the right kind of ways? There's no point coming in with an ideal vision, a conceptually coherent account that nobody can work with because it's so out of sync with the realities of research or clinical practice or health policy conversations. And finally, ethics works best here if it's embedded in a partnership with researchers and healthcare professionals and health policy makers. We have to be able to be responsive and embedded to the kinds of problems that are coming up on the ground, they're bubbling up and need attending to. Again, different problems get solved if we work in silos, and so we end up solving problems that don't exist in the real world if we're positioned in that way. So my approach here and the approach that we take in our centre for our contributions is very much to be, as it were, embedded in the research communities and the practice communities that Singapore has in this area and that are building quite quickly across the island. So I want to quickly finish with three examples of projects that we have going on in the Centre for Biomedical Ethics in healthy longevity ethics, and that we'd like to work with people on over the course of the next few years. I mentioned already the Prometheus ethics study, which I worked with Andrea Mayer and her team on. There we were looking at the participants in Prometheus and sitting down and doing interviews both before and after the study to make sense of how they identify and make and think about the value of these kinds of interventions for them personally and what their visions of the future of health longevity medicine might be in Singapore. And we're evaluating some of those in relationship to ethical principles and what that might mean for good practice. We have a big project funded by the NMRC, CREST SG, which is, as part of its work, working with the Health Longevity Academy in particular, embedded within that group, to co-design ethical approaches to health longevity service models, and again, particularly with an interest here in primary care, and clinical practice design in ways that will involve considerable engagement with patient groups, with members of the public, and with other professional stakeholders to try to align, as it were, value commitments and ethical concerns with the realities of what's going on in building research priorities and clinical models of care. And finally, I'm leading a project called Canaries, which is focused particularly on the community setting. Here we're interested in exposome risk, the kind of particular interest in noise pollution, air pollution, light pollution within HDBs, and how we think about, as people are exposed to these kinds of risks that have an impact on health span, what it might mean to have an ethical responsibility within that community setting, as neighbour, as landlord, perhaps, as shopkeeper. How do we configure a network of responsibility to try to understand who has a stake in the ethics of these kinds of low-level community risks to health span? So I hope to share more about that with people in due course if you're interested. But there's a lot going on, and we have new projects in development and very keen to collaborate. So please do get in touch if you'd like to do so. But I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Michael. Lots to talk about. I think that I was, whenever I hear an ethicist, I'm getting ready to have an argument, but I think I agree with everything for the most part. It's going to be a boring discussion.
That's good to hear.
It's funny to hear, though, because at the risk of monologuing, when I started working in this field, which was a long, long time ago. We were completely ignored. And then we started finding discoveries around 2000. And we started talking about health span. I think the first time I used the slide was 2005. And it just was approached as if we were trying to create some radical revolution that and that slowing aging. And I think that's been partly misrepresented by the idea of billionaires hacking to live forever and things like that. And that hasn't helped in some ways, but it's been a long slog to get to the point where healthy longevity is being really considered in care. But I've never thought of it as that revolutionary. Really, it's about maintaining the population healthy and functional. And I think I think the Hippocratic Oath is where I always come back to, because I'm not an MD. I've never read it. I had never read it. And every time somebody brought it up, they said, first, do no harm, which isn't really in the Hippocratic Oath. But then I got to thinking about it and thought, if we're doing nothing for people for the first 50 years of their life, unless they get some disease, which is rare in that age range for the most part, then we're harming them. Why is it that we're waiting until people have some ICD code to put effort into trying to do something? And to me, that's just common sense. And that's sort of my view on what healthy longevity really is let's work early and try to, work with the client, not the patient, to optimize their health and their future. Is that how you look at it?
I think it is, yeah. I mean, I think you're right that on one side, that's, as it were, evolutionary, and it's sort of common sense. And at the same time, it's quite a revolutionary idea to think about, our obligations in healthcare to promote the health of those who are well, right? I mean, to think about everybody in need of an intervention. And I think that's, partly because of how we configure the boundary between health and illness. That's controversial, I think, but it does make a lot of sense. So yes, I think that's right. And then of course you get the challenge that there are just trade-offs that arise in that kind of position, right? Because not everybody necessarily wants to buy into that kind of approach. So I think that's where it gets interesting.
Well, I think it also comes back to client empowerment. I think that, when you talk to doctors, you still hear this. You heard it a lot more 10 years ago, that I don't do prevention because it doesn't work. I tell people what to do, they don't do it. And even when you look at a drug like statins, which, of course there are side effects of statins, but it's generally been a very effective drug for the population, the compliance rate is extremely low on statins. Even for people with high cholesterol that are at risk of very bad diseases, the compliance in some places is measured at 30 to 40%. So, I've always felt like this comes back to sorry, I'm supposed to be asking questions and I'm talking, but I've always felt like this comes back to what you spend a lot of time talking about, which is empowering the client to make their decisions. If they're educated and feel like they're in charge of their health decisions, then they're much more likely to comply with the decisions they make. Maybe that's naive, but it seems like an effective strategy to really change how we're doing this, prevention and making it work.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Yeah.
So, the longevity clinics, you really have that opportunity. I work with a bunch of private clinics, and I'll come to the problem, which I want to ask you about. I think you really have that opportunity for empowerment. You can bring people in, you have the time with them, you have a range of options available for them, depending on jurisdiction. Some of those options, I would say, go beyond safe. But in any case, if a clinic is in a transparent way describing the safety and the potential efficacy of the intervention, then the client is really at a point where they can decide if they want to do lifestyle and wait until some things are validated, or if they want to do supplements, or if they want to do peptides, or go stem cells, or whatever, depending on the region. So that really offers that environment where you can do that. And that's what I think is fascinating about the clinics. The problem is, how do you scale that? Because most people come into clinics and they're upper income people that have had education, and they're obviously interested in this, or they wouldn't be spending money to be there. So it's a subset of the population. And so what I think a lot about is, how do we democratize this process in a way that it gets out. Everybody has this empowerment, not just the people that can afford to come to clinics. And do you think you must think about that? I mean, how do you achieve that goal?
I mean, it's clearly the right thing to be thinking about, because, in a way, the people we need to most focus on are the ones that are not engaging, because they're the ones who are likely to need the most support, I think, right? So, the scaling problem is difficult. I mean, there's a kind of systems level aspect to this, and then there's a sort of relationship with your practitioner type set of ideas, I think, as well. So, we have to have a model which enables this sort of idea of continuity of care. Because it seems to me that's what's so critical about healthy longevity in general, is this idea that, sort of life and health plan management across the life course. So you need to basically have regular touch points. You've got to evolve these sort of personalized plans. My understanding is that most health systems are not ready for that kind of underpinning, as it were, kind of like the basic foundational notions of care. Now, I think there are opportunities there, but you can't force people to do that, and you can't afford to do it for every single person either, I don't think.
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't argue for forcing. I kind of think in some ways maybe this is an opportunity for the education system, because, I look at universities and I feel like they're going to have to change, or they're going to be obsolete. And we're both in universities, right now we educate people, and some people come back for graduate school, I know, but we push people out the door at 22 and say, you're ready for life. And with AI and other things that are happening, life's changing too fast. Whatever you're taught at 22 is going to be obsolete at 30. And so I think that really universities should be bringing people back on a regular basis now, and trying to update them mainly with how to adapt to the changing society, not so much just filling them with knowledge. And maybe that could include sort of health practice and, personalized education around the health choices they should be making in the age they're in. I don't think we should force any. I'm kind of libertarian at heart. That got somehow interpreted to be Republican. I'm not that, but I am kind of libertarian. And
probably libertarian, yeah.
And I think people should be making their own choices. It's how do you educate them and encourage them to make better choices, I think.
That's right, yeah. I think there's a challenge also for the healthcare practitioners involved in this domain to work out what it means to kind of work in the right kind of way with the right kind of roles to support people in different circumstances. In the current model of sort of hierarchical teams of people doesn't necessarily going to quite translate, I think, into what you're describing. But so I think there's a kind of recalibration of the roles of practitioners involved in this as well.
Yeah, maybe it's not doctors that are doing the well span or health span thing. Maybe and that I think we training people, allied professionals or somebody to fill that role, I think could be a very valuable strategy going forward.
Yeah,
I think Singapore is in a unique position because it's like they're really trying to take the lead on this. And this RAE 2030 program on healthy longevities is an indicator of that. So, and I think this is a good community to do that, because people are very, relative to other places, and I'm thinking about U.S. and Britain here, they trust the government and they comply with recommendations made by the government. So I'm really encouraged that things can happen here and make this a role model for healthy longevity. How do you see Singapore going forward in that role?
I think you're right about that. It's the right kind of circumstances to be able to make progress. I think that's right. I think one of the interesting things for me, and I'm particularly interested in sort of the public health elements of this and the community elements of this, is the ways in which this is going to be a non-governmental set of projects as well. So how we understand our obligations to each other in relationship to healthy longevity as a society, and thinking about aging in more general, that's a kind of under-researched question. It's like we can't be reliant, as it were, on the practitioners or the policymakers to solve all of these problems. They're going to be familial, social, community-based responsibilities, I think, that need more clarification. And that's an area of interest, but I think a lot of this is quite transformative potentially of people's living environments and the ways in which they live with their friends and colleagues and such like.
Well, I think a good example of that is the U.S. use of GLP-1 agonists. I read somewhere where 18% of homes, somebody's using a GLP-1 agonist now. And usually it's one of the senior people in the home that has influence, right? And so you're starting to see fast food sales go down in the U.S. probably because, the older person's overweight, they're using the drug, they're losing appetite, and they're influencing the decisions that are made throughout the house. That's a good example of how things change in unexpected ways when you have medical innovations. And certainly healthy longevity, as it becomes more successful, is going to confer those. How do you look at the changes that are going to happen? I'm assuming you're not a dystopian person about this, that you see it as an opportunity.
I mean, I think they're going to be. I think you're right. That one of the problems has been that there's been a kind of over focus on the billionaire biohacker types, and so I think at the lower level, what we're talking about here is a soft evolution of healthcare practice that better meets people's individual needs around healthcare across their life. So I think you're absolutely right. The real progress, and why I feel positive about it, is we're sort of thinking about supporting people to be healthy, which seems like a very natural, normal thing to be doing in a healthcare system. So I think, we don't want to get kind of too lost with the big biohacking type examples, because really at the lowest level, this is just incremental change to health improvement practices in a system that needs to evolve to codify those in the right way. So I'm very positive about that, because I think we'll just adapt, and I think people will see that health span, a lot of the concepts like health span, biological age, they make real common sense to people. So I think the chance of buying people into those ways of thinking about interventions is very easy.
Yeah, I never really thought, health span was almost a contrived word when we started using it, because really health span and lifespan, most interventions are going to affect both. And I think, maybe they'll affect health span more than lifespan and compress morbidity, but we don't really know that. Either way, it's a good thing economically right now. But yeah, I think it'll be more gradual too. It's not like we're going to suddenly stop aging. And even if we did, there wouldn't be any 200-year-old people for 81 more years. So it's,
exactly.
So anyway, that I can talk. I'm talking too much. Maybe I can bring Kevin in and to ask some questions from the audience. And I'm expecting the same kind of performance you did on the video, Kevin. So you better be entertaining.
All right, I'll try my best. I think in the essence of time, let me just try to condense the general ideas that our viewers have, and that is something about you talked about respecting the autonomy of patients and of people, of individuals. How should policymakers and healthcare systems navigate the tension between now if someone says I have the ability to age healthily, but I may not want to take that path. So how do we manage that, and how should we actually promote healthy aging in these people?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I actually wrote a piece for CNA about 3 or 4 years ago, which is sort of looking at the kind of case of the intransigent smoker, the person who just sees smoking as a fundamental part of the quality of their life. They have no interest in giving up. They know the health risks. They just accept them. That for them is a price worth paying. So, firstly, we can't force people to be healthy, right? We can't. There's no ways that's going to work in any practical sense, and it's not going to have the desired goals if we try. So, for me, the interesting dimensions here are about different levels of intervention. So firstly, we can intervene in communities, we can intervene in systems that can have health promoting goals without taking away or manipulating people's actual choices to do unhealthy things. So the interesting thing in a community level is like the ways in which you just tweak the ability for people to live less or more healthy in certain kind of ways. And that seems to me to be a much more appropriate form of intervention for, as it were, hard to reach, or particularly groups of people who are particularly struggling with their own prioritization of health, or they suffer for socioeconomic reasons with disadvantage when it comes to health outcomes. There is going to be, I think, a different model of intervention when it comes to choice. So we think a lot about choice, like does the person choose to do this or not? I think the idea behind calibrating a healthcare encounter between a team and a user, which is about self-reliance, self-promotion, and enablement, is going to be setting some goals and targets. Now, the person might still say, I'm not interested in giving up smoking ever. But really, that's okay. The point is you're kind of working with them to find other avenues of their life where health can be promoted. So I think if you take a sort of plan-based approach where you're longitudinally following somebody and enabling them, empowering them to make their own, exercise some control over their health journey, you'll find somewhere where you can make a meaningful difference. And that's about, I think, as far as we go. So I'm not one for imposing, and we can't even impose anyway. But we can manipulate, we can configure, and we can enable in other ways, I think.
I don't want to be devil's advocate. I will be devil's advocate here because I agree with you. But you could make cigarettes illegal. I mean, other Scheduled I drugs are illegal, and because they are harm to society. I mean, I'm not advocating that. I don't smoke, but I also don't advocate that. But those are the kinds of choices government has to make. Where do you draw the line between freedom and
Yeah, so that's right. So there's kind of government set of questions about how health longevity gets promoted. But I mean, the level of the kind of, as it were, in the current state of play, for a doctor or for a health professional, it's not very little you can kind of do. But no, I totally agree with you. I think part of this is about how we think about high level policy making around health promoting interventions. Yeah, of course.
I have another question, quite interesting one. So, how has your work in bioethics changed, the way you personally think about your own aging?
That's really interesting. I think I'm like the problem case, really, because my approach in my own life has not been one about taking care of my health or aging well. It's been about just doing what I want to do in the way I want to do it, following my own sort of sense of what makes me happy and gives me pleasure most of the time. So I think I've done some of the engagement work with Andrea Mayer's team on some of the interventions that they offer, and it does profoundly change the ways in which you think about the kind of values in play. I think so. I think there's a real danger of over individualizing this stuff. So what I've kind of learned is really that I'm not the kind of focal point. Like, it's a question about how across a society like ours we approach this with justice and equity in mind. So first it's about thinking about the bigger social level outcomes for this kind of thing. So it's less about me and more about the societies we're trying to create. But I also think that kind of exploring health longevity has made me think much more broadly about well-being and its relationship to health. I think that's something that health longevity is going to have to kind of face up to at some point. So, again, there's the smoker who's saying, this is good for me, is making a claim about what a good outcome is, right? What their well-being requires. Now, they're incorrect if we configure that in health-related terms, but they're not incorrect if we think about it in other kind of well-being terms. So, those things have to be navigated, and I think for me, I'm personally trying to navigate those things as I work through this as well. So we kind of live as we do in this world.
That's an interesting take. Yeah. Let me look through some of the questions again. Okay. So the Canaries project, it sounds like a really interesting one. But I think you mentioned that, there's some there's some differences in the populations of the participants. So how are we recruiting these participants to ensure a more representative sample of the
So I mean, there's a lot more to say about that project than I have time for, but it's called Canaries because our actual focus is on people who have particular vulnerabilities to negative exposures in terms of health outcomes. So we're actually particularly targeting people with certain kinds of chronic conditions where they're at particular heightened risk of negative health outcomes from air pollution, etc., deprivation of sleep and such like, people with anxiety disorders, these kinds of things. So actually we're more narrowly configuring that. I can see them as canaries. Well, the project is actually called Canaries in the Concrete Jungle. So the idea is to see this as a subgroup of people who can give us sort of advanced warning of the kind of concerns that the general population will face in terms of their health span in relationship to exposures in communities that are impactful on health in a negative way. So we're looking at how they navigate their communities, so these people with particular chronic needs. And the ethics comes in because we're more than just sort of understanding their life experiences as people with vulnerabilities of those kinds. We're trying to work out what it would mean to be appropriately responsive ethically to their needs in a community environment. So the standard view is, look, the government has to give people what they need to be healthy. But of course, what we're seeing in health longevity, particularly around things like exposures, these are the product of communities living together. They're also under the control to some degree of elements of their community environment, like, for example, the landlord and tenant arrangement, or the neighborhood, the relationship between neighbors. Those can have a significant impact on people's health outcomes. So people don't talk much about this idea of decentralized ethical responsibility within communities, but I think that's what we really want to explore. What obligations do we have for those who are, as it were, canaries, in the sense that they are going to be people who can identify particular risks associated with noise pollution, air pollution, light pollution, and such like.
These are really the core questions of society and community.
Yeah, exactly. They are. Yeah, they're not, as you were, special. They are that's right. They're just about making it clear that there are maybe some certain kind of responsibilities that individuals have towards each other. That's right. Yeah, they're nothing special. Yeah.
Maybe one more question, Kevin.
All right. Okay, so can doctors advocate, longevity promoting therapies that are not yet in major clinical guidelines?
I mean, you mean sort of as an ethical question, should
Yeah, I guess. I would assume it should be backed by the data, of course, and not.
Yeah, so I think they should take care to do that. I mean, I think, as professionals, they're going to be held to a certain kind of account, right? So they need to be able to be, if they're doing with their professional hat on, then I think the answer will probably be no, unless they can point to the relevant evidence and it's been approved in the right kind of way for deployment. Now, you can clearly advocate for health longevity without doing that. So there are going to be other ways in which they can advocate, I think, for the rapid evaluation of those interventions and seeing them to be translated into clinics. But yeah, no, I think this is an area where people have to be a little bit careful. I mean, the regulatory models don't quite fit yet, so people are struggling even to know how to regulate these things. But we have to be very careful, I think, when we're kind of acting within our professional responsibilities and, as qualified healthcare professionals to follow the relevant codes and such like that are in place. And as you say, that's about pointing towards evidence and standards of practice and gold standards and such like.
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, for the answers.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. We'll have to have you back to talk some more. And
thanks so much.
Thanks, Kevin. I think that was the most creative video at the beginning that we've had yet. So you're the winner right now. Even though you showed David, you're still the winners. So I just want everyone to follow us on social media. If you haven't already, do follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram to stay updated on our latest webinars, research highlights, and events. We'd love to have you as part of our community, and we have some exciting announcements and new initiatives coming up, so stay tuned. July 2nd will be our next show. We'll have Kevin White, who is being very coy about his title right now, but it's going to have to do with genomics and systems biology, I'm guessing. And I want to leave you tonight with a teaser for our next episode. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandra and I'm a Year 3 PhD candidate at Young London School of Medicine. I work with HLTRP under the guidance of Prof Vincenzo Sorrentino. As a computational biologist trying to bridge AI supercomputing to experimental biology, I try to save time, some space and energy, and a lot of money trying to figure out drugs using my computer and then test it out in the lab.